Once upon a time, in a faraway land,
What are fairy stories?
The strange and wondrous place where nothing is as it seems.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest?
Fairy is a perilous land.
Before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep
It
well.
is the place you visit
A world
in your
of
dreams.
myth and magic.
when the clock began to
The
chime
evening
midnight,
star sailed down through the
A
sky.
mysterious voice began calling to the sad
She
princess.
pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell on the
In a
small
trance,
white
she
window.
followed the haunting
And peered
sound
into
of
the
a
hollow
winding
tree.
stairway to the top of the
You can read
tower.
along with me in your book.
waved her wand and said the magic words.
Let's begin now.
Well met, witches. Welcome to Storybook Sacred Lore of Witchcraft. Today we have a very special guest in our circle, Morgan Daimler. Morgan teaches classes and writes about Irish myth and magical practices, fairies, and related subjects. Morgan's writing has appeared in a variety of magazines, including Pagan Dawn and Witches and Pagans, and anthologies including Naming the Goddess and Harp, Club, and Cauldron. Morgan is also the author of a variety of fiction books, such as the urban fantasy paranormal romance series Between the Worlds, and nonfiction through Moon Books, including Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk. Morgan also has presented papers at various universities, conferences on subjects relating to fairy belief. And I know you are a very prolific author, and you share a lot of that with us online and on academia.edu, etc. And I think you have an upcoming presentation for Mystic South.
Yes, I am doing several for Mystic South, one of which I'm going to be talking about the sort of historic relationship between early modern witches in Scotland and fairies. So that should be really fun, I think.
Wonderful. And I'm positive that anybody that this is going to reach is familiar with you and your work. What type of craft how would you describe your craft?
So that is such a great question. I sort of involuntarily refer to it as fairy witchcraft, just because that's the simplest explanation to use that most people will immediately grasp at least a portion of it. Basically, I practice a type of witchcraft which is based on early modern practices. Some people would call traditional witchcraft, but with a main focus on the good folk, the fair folk, and sort of the historic relationships that used to happen between witches and fairies, which is one of the reasons it's a main interest of mine.
That is so fascinating. And Dave Gaddy, the Weathered Wise Man, is also with us today. Hi, Dave. Why don't you let everybody know, in case they don't, who you are and what type of magic you practice?
Well, first of all, I think Morgan's being very humble. She's one of the headliners at Mystic South, just so y'all know. And I'm looking forward to those classes. I'm Dave Gaddy. I'm the Weathered Wise Man. And my craft is a mix of traditional Appalachian folk magic. It's pretty eclectic, a pretty eclectic practice, but a lot of animism in my practice. I'm also, I just released a book in February called The Simple Magic of Wild Things, and it's about my practice as a Southern male witch and my influences from my grandmother and my ancestors. And I will also be teaching at Mystic South this year, and the class is going to be about using ancestral, let's talk plainly, ancestral magic for healing of trauma.
I love that.
Likewise, I'm really looking forward to that. And we are gathering today to discuss the Ballad of Tam Lin. And Morgan, you suggested this subject. What made you think of this tale?
I thought it would be a good choice because it is one that more people are familiar with. It's also a ballad that has a lot of stuff in it that I think would be fun to discuss and is pertinent to witchcraft and magic and to people who are interested in the good folk and that whole range. And it's also a ballad, even though it dates back considerable ways into at least the 18th century in writing, that we have records of it, not recordings, because that would be strange, records of it. But it's also one that is continued to be performed today, which is not true. Some of the other ballads have kind of fallen into obscurity, but Tam Lin, you can still find a lot of modern, particularly folk singers performing it. So I just liked that it's got deep roots, but it's still around today, and it's got a lot of good stuff in it to talk about.
Since you mentioned that part of it, I was curious, is it still being performed because it was recorded, like because it was written down, or do you think that oral transmission is relatively unbroken?
I think it's a little bit of both. So if we look at the history of the ballad, we find that there's basically 11 main versions of it that were recorded, which kind of shows that over the period between, I think it was like the 1760s and like the mid 1800s, it was being performed widely enough that you had regional variations. It wasn't just in like one very specific location, even though the ballad itself is about one very specific location. And the modern versions, we see this sort of continuing adaptation, which is something that you find, of course, when things are passed on orally. They get changed a little bit over time as different performers tackle them and sort of give a different side to the story, if you will. So I think that it being recorded helped preserve it, so we know what the older versions are. But I think that the fact that it's sort of maintained its popularity in performance has given it the life that it has today, as opposed to some of the other ones that we don't see as commonly.
Right. And what is the ballad about? Could you give us a quick rundown of the tale?
Sure. So the absolute short version of it is it's a story about a woman who rescues her lover from the fairies, from the good folk. The slightly longer version is it's a story about a woman. Her name changes in the different versions, but we'll go with Janet because that's the one in the oldest version. Woman named Janet who decides to go into the Carterhaugh Woods, which is in her father's lands. Her father's a lord. And she's been warned not to do this because there is an elf or a fairy there. The words are used interchangeably in the older material. And he's guarding a well. And anyone who goes to the well has to pay basically a tax to him, a toll for passing through. And it's either going to be a gold ring, a green mantle, or the woman's virginity. And Janet decides this is where she has to go. So she goes there. She meets the guardian of the well. His name is Tam Lin. Tam is a shortened Scots version of Thomas, and Lin means a pool or a well. So it's basically Thomas of the well. And depending on the version, very different ways that this can go. But the two of them end up becoming lovers. And then she returns to her family, to her father. After a short amount of time goes by, it becomes clear that she's pregnant, which does not go over particularly well with her family. Medieval Scotland was not really a place that was super accepting of that sort of thing. And she gets sort of confronted and called out in front of her father and loudly proclaims that the father of her child is no earthly knight. He's not a human person, that he is one of the fair folk. And then she returns to the well. And depending on the version, in some versions, she returns to try to find like an abortifacient herb so that she can put an end to the situation, we'll just say. And in any version, Tam Lin then appears again and stops her from whatever she was intending to do, asks her why she's doing that. And then she has this very tearful moment where she asks him if he was ever an earthly knight or if he'd always been one of the good folk. And he tells her that he had been born human and had been kidnapped by the Queen of Fairies. And that was how he ended up where he was. And then he goes on to tell her if she's very brave, she can go at midnight on Samhain, on Halloween, to a particular crossroads, and the good folk will be passing by in this, they call it a raid, but it's like basically a big procession. And if she's very brave, she can pull him off of his horse, and if she holds on to him, then she can win him back from the fairies, and then he can be her husband, her human husband. So she goes to the crossroads, she does what he tells her to do. When she pulls him from the horse, the fairy queen then starts transforming him into all these different things: a bear and a wolf and a lion and a snake, a burning piece of iron, and finally a fire. Actually, I might have reversed it. It might have been the fire first, then the burning piece of iron. And finally, she puts him in the well full of water nearby, and he comes out just like the day he was born, mortal man. And she wraps her kirtle, her cover around him, and has basically won him, gotten him free of the fairies. And his big concern with wanting to be freed, I should mention, is that the fairies every year on Samhain pay a tithe to hell. They basically rent fairyland from the devil. And he was afraid he was going to be the payment. So he was very motivated to convince her to help him. But she does, she wins him. And in some versions, the fairy queen does not take this well at all and then curses her. But we never hear about what happens to her after that, just that she gets her husband. And that's basically that is the short version, believe it or not.
Thank you for
I believe it because I think I read every one of the versions.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there's a lot of different, and the variations are fascinating. The way that different versions kind of emphasize different things or have things play out slightly differently.
Yeah, I read one, I think it was like Child 39 maybe, but where Janet is in her room and she's thinking about the roses and she's looking at the roses growing, and that one kept returning to this theme of the red roses. That was really, really lovely. Carter Ho, is that an actual place? Is there any significance to the name?
There's not the name as far as I'm aware, but it is an actual place. It is near Selkirk in Scotland. You can go there. I believe it's actually a bit of a tourist site at this point, as everything is these days. But you can go to where, at least portions of the story were supposed to have happened. Wow. So when people would have been telling the ballad or singing the ballad originally, it would have been very grounded in the human world.
Dave, was there any aspects that jumped out to you right away when you were going through the many accounts of it?
In reading some of the later versions, it was funny, the symbolism that was used. Like you talk about one of the sacrifices was virginity. So in the version by R.J. Stewart, it talks about she plucks a rose. And I'm thinking, okay, that's a tame version of saying she did the deed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also in that version, it also pulls out the abortive piece of it. So I thought that it was interesting how each piece dealt with those pieces of the story or of the ballad.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the versions change what we would consider significant details, but keep it this one cohesive story. So in many versions, when she goes to the well, she's looking for an abortifacient herb, and she's still very early in her pregnancy. But there are a few versions where she is like just about to give birth. She is like extremely pregnant when she goes to rescue him, which when you imagine it has a very different feel to it. This idea of this like heavily pregnant woman pulling this knight off a horse and, enduring all these trials. I think it's a lot more emotionally evocative in specific ways than the idea of her, much earlier in the situation. And also the implication with her going much later that she had known him for longer.
The first time she goes to the well, she prepares herself and she has the tokens that are required to make the payment. Should we look at what those items are, the ring and the green mantle and of course herself?
I mean, speaking of symbolism,
yeah,
it's definitely really interesting because the gold ring would normally represent like fidelity, loyalty. Say we would associate strongly with like a marriage vow. The green mantle is one of the things that stands out a lot to me because green is a particular color associated with the good folk. And it was sort of a folk belief in Scotland for a long time that women in particular should not wear green, because if you wear green, it might attract the fairies' attention. There's another ballad called the Ballad of Alice Brand, where Alice and her lover in the story end up running away into this elven wood, and the elf king gets very angry with her because she's wearing green. The fairies' green, fairies' fatal green is what they actually say in the ballad. But this idea that like wearing green was not a good idea, a safe idea, especially around the good folk. So the fact that that is in there, you can sort of interpret it either as you're giving them something that they would want, or they would take that as a toll because it's something that belongs to them. He didn't choose that for the toll, though. He chose number 3. He took option number 3.
As most men would.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually raises a lot of questions, and we never have any answers to this, so it's just food for thought. But what motivated her to go there?
Right.
Because she knew she had been told, warned not to go there for this specific reason. And she very intentionally does go in all of the versions of the ballad. It's not like she just wanders into it, unawares. She makes a choice to go knowing what's probably going to happen. And then it sets off this chain of events. So to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about the story is just why. Why did she do that?
But I also see that as symbolism of the feminine spirit, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
It was a choice to go, but it was her fortitude, her determination that set all these events into place.
Yeah.
I mean, she's
a great protagonist.
Yeah. It's kind of like the Southern phrase that I'm going to do it despite you. So if you tell me not to do something, I'm going to do it just to prove it can be done. And like I said, that shows to me the strength of character in her and the strength behind her thought process and determination.
Mm-hmm. And we can definitely take it as symbolic of her, taking control of her own life, seizing her own power, because she is making a choice, we find out later in the ballad that is not popular and that causes some complications in her life, but it's her choosing to do those things as opposed to her being told what's going to happen in her life by other people.
Well, and then the strength toward the end of it. I mean, a pregnant woman, very pregnant woman, according to some of the versions, willing to take on the things that the queen of the fairies changes him into. She's willing to take on a bear, fire. I mean, this woman was tough.
Yeah. Yeah. She's a great protagonist. I really like her. There's actually another, it's sometimes considered a ballad and sometimes considered a poem, but it shows up elsewhere in Scottish folklore. It's called the Faerie of Corrywater, where it's a sister who goes to try to rescue her brother. And it does not end the same way because when he gets turned into fire, she panics. And depending on how you read it, she either dies or she just fails to save him. And then he is in fact taken by the fairies and not seen again. So yeah, Janet had a lot of moxie.
Janet's strength also comes into contrast with the fact that her father is in the story, or we hear of the father in the story, and that he's telling her not to go to the well, I believe, or forbidding people to go to the well.
Yes, it starts basically by saying that he had forbidden anyone to go there, and then that's what she immediately does. So, yeah, probably a statement about her personality. For sure. And it is kind of implied later on when it's revealed that she's pregnant in front of the entire court, is how that happens. That he might have been sort of favoring her, like that he wasn't very heavy-handed with her.
Okay.
Because he's more disappointed in a lot of the versions than he is like angry or, demanding that she handle it a certain way. And like I said, she stands up in front of everyone and is like, it's my, the father of my child is not an earthly knight. None of you can claim this baby, basically.
She is involved in a relation with the elfin knight. And I know this is something that you've written about, presented about, human fairy relations. Should we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I ended up accidentally like minoring in human and fairy relations with my research.
Is that an official option now?
Apparently. No, it turned out to be the question I was asked the most often across the years. So I ended up doing a lot of research just so I could give people, the best answers when they were asking, because, and this would be going back, I'm going to really make myself sound old, but be going back a ways. I think it's gotten a little better. It used to be, though, that it was just an immediate assumption that, thanks to Theosophy in particular, that fairies are incorporeal and generally asexual and agendered, that they are just sort of spirits or energy, which is very different from most of the traditional understandings of fairies and elves and etc. So I had a lot of people who would come to me and just ask, like, is this something that's even possible? Like, almost like it's a joke, like, oh, this is kind of nonsense. And it's like, actually, no, there's like hundreds and hundreds of years of precedent for this idea. I actually just finished, I wrote a whole book about it, which was what I was joking about with the accidentally minoring in it. And it goes back a really long way across Western Europe. Not just in Scotland, like we find it in Ireland. We find the idea kind of all over the place that, sometimes that happens. It's interesting in the case of Tam Lin because he was originally human. Mm-hmm. And this is another thing we find like all across fairy belief, this idea that the good folk can take a human and transform them, turn them into an elf or a fairy, whatever you want to call it in English. And that then they just become that. It's not like they're a human living in the world of fairy, like they actually are one of the good folk at that point. And then her rescuing him is something that we find in folklore, but usually it's not someone who's been taken for that long. Like the implication with him is that he has been living in the world of fairy for quite a long time. And again, depending on the version, but usually. And nonetheless, she manages to save him. Whereas in normal folklore, it would be like you'd have a year. And usually if you can't rescue them within that year, then you lose the opportunity to do so. So yeah, lots of really good, interesting stuff going on there.
Yeah. And I think in one of the versions, it denoted that he had been there for 7 years.
Yeah.
Or it kind of sounded like he had been there for 7 years and then he was going to be sacrificed to hell on Samhain.
Yep. So there's 11 main versions of the older ballad, and then there's 3 fragment versions. So it's like 14 altogether. And in some of them, he had actually known the main protagonist, Janet. Sometimes she's also named Margaret, but we'll just stick with Janet for this. That they had known each other as children. And then when he was a small child, like 4 or 5, he had been taken by the Queen of Fairies. In other versions, like I said, it's unclear how long he was there, but he was taken as an adult. He fell from his horse when he was hunting, and the Queen of Fairies caught him before he hit the ground and swept him away to the world of fairy. But there are other versions, yes, where he had not been there for a full 7 years. And the tithe happens every 7 years in a lot of the folklore. And that's why he was like, well, my time is just about up. Because another aspect of belief we find in Scotland around particularly the fairies tied to hell is that they don't want to give their own people.
Mhm.
They have to pay this tithe in souls. They don't want to pay their own people, obviously. So what they'll do is they'll steal humans, and then they'll give those humans instead to pay the rent, so to speak. Take that however you will, I guess. And he, because he had originally been human, was afraid that he was going to be the one chosen this time around. So, yeah, like I said, it's fascinating the different layers you get depending on which version you're looking at.
And maybe this is a nice time to veer off into that. You have written your own version of the tale with a queer human fairy relation.
Yes. So I have a small series. I do intend to continue it and do more with it. I just have a lot going on. But I have a small series. It's called Queering Faerie, where I take different ballads and I rewrite them as prose tales, but from a queer perspective. So The Well at Carterhaugh is the one that's the Tam Lin one. It was the first one I did. I keep the protagonist female, but I have the knight at the well also be a woman, and kind of have the protagonist realize that this is why she's never had any interest in marrying any men, because obviously Scotland at that time, it wasn't super open to those sorts of concepts. And she ends up basically paying the same toll in a different way with the knight. And I changed it a little bit because I needed to make it a prose story. So I needed it to be a little longer than what happens in the ballad. So the first time she goes, I believe she gives her green mantle, and then she goes back a second time to the well and gives her ring. And then the third time she goes back is when she pays the third toll. So they have a little bit of a relationship built up before we get to the third toll part. Mm-hmm. And then in my version, her father is not as kind to her as in the ballad version, and is planning to force her to marry someone, sort of to help him with an alliance he wants to have. And she kind of accidentally blurts out that she doesn't want to do it because she's, in love with someone else. And he does not take that well at all. Again, context of the culture at the time. And she ends up kind of running away. And the knight tells her, in my version, because I also like to do a bit of a flipped ending with mine, instead of her rescuing the knight from the good folk and bringing her into the human world, the knight rescues her, but she still has to pass these same trials. She has to prove to the Queen of Fairies that she's worth it, basically, that she's worth joining them. So we still have the challenge and the trials and the knight being transformed into these different things, and the protagonist kind of, not being afraid and running away. And then in the end, she's taken with the fairies and goes off to live a much happier life with a group of people who don't care who you're in love with, basically.
I loved that. And that, yes, Margaret still exhibits the same ideal of strength, but then it's like the ending was queered as well on top. So yeah, I enjoyed the twist.
Thank you.
But it's so nice to see things like that being written nowadays, especially for the queer young people coming around. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't get that in history, and it's nice to see that written from that point of view.
Yeah, I wanted to have something out there where people could see themselves in these stories, because obviously, queer people have always been there in the world, always. But when we look at what's recorded, it tends to be so heteronormative. Mm-hmm. And it gives this impression, like there's a running joke with all my Facebook friends, and I'm sure much further than my personal circle, but there's a particular woodcut that gets passed around, and it's two women in bed together. And it's from a textbook, and the caption literally says, like, they were such good friends that, on cold nights they would like help keep each other warm, or something that's just nonsensical given what's actually in the picture. And so like that code of like they're just good friends gets passed around. But it's an example of the way that heteronormativity gets put onto anything. It is clearly, an image of two women who are more than friends, but it gets taught and passed on in a textbook as, no, they're just, this was normal in history. Just really good friends would keep each other warm at night in a completely normal way. So I wanted to have stuff out there where people could be like, no, if you're alive in 16th century Scotland, 17th century Scotland, then maybe you prefer women, and that's okay. The fairies will accept you, even if your family doesn't. Basically.
Well, and I think that kind of it can flow into, if you think of some of the slurs that have been passed around. I mean, gay people, especially gay men, for years have been called fairies.
Mm-hmm. There's a really fascinating history with that too, because that started, the term was originally used in the 18th century against promiscuous women. And then it became a code term for prostitutes. And then it became a term for gay men. So yeah, the term itself has always had these queer overtones to it. This idea of people who were outside of what was considered, the sexual norm. So yeah, and I love that about it.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very cool. There's something, and I've done some university presentations about this, so I do not want to go off on a tangent or you'll never get me to stop talking. But there's something about the history of belief in fairies and the history of humans who are queer, humans who are outside of what's considered heteronormative, that just really interlocks. Humans who tended to be seen as deviant in any way, and I'm not saying deviant in a judgmental way, just deviant from what was considered the norm at the time, always tended to have this strong association with fairies or the good folk or the supernatural. And it's really fascinating to look at that across history.
Do you even find that in the craft? I mean, as far as the history there? It
gets a little tricky just because of the way things are recorded. And a lot of what we have for the older material tends to come from like witchcraft trial accounts. And they had a very particular focus with what they were looking at. But we do definitely see some evidence of it if you're kind of willing to take a very close look at it, I guess we'll say. So like Anne Jeffreys, who was a woman in Cornwall who was very associated with the fairies. We could probably do a whole episode just talking about her because her story is really fascinating. But she was described by people at the time and by historians later as someone who was not the typical woman of her time period. She was seen as acting very much like a man, which obviously did not win her a lot of friends when she was younger. But, she was described as being overly bold and willing to do things, in a way that normally men would have done it, which is clearly, in my opinion, some queer coding going on. Because you don't normally see women described that way. And then she gets all tied up with fairies and a lot of interesting things happen from there. So I think it's there, but it's just really hard to find.
There's something that's striking me now, which may not amount to much, but that I'd never thought of before, which is the idea of the pejorative use of the term fairy and people being like ostracized or outcast, and how the fairies themselves are wandering. They do this biannual or twice annual procession from one place to another, which features into this story. What is the lore around this procession that's going to happen for Samhain?
So the basic idea is that the fairies, even though we tend to associate them like living in one particular place, like this would be the fairy hill of whatever, In actuality, they move their homes, they move their main locations at least twice a year, and particularly at Samhain and Beltane. And those are the times where in folklore, like, you're supposed to be aware that you're more likely to encounter the good folk, that there's more of them out and about. And you can see these raids, these big processions. It also is interesting to note that those two times, Beltane and Samhain, are two of the four. They're called quarter days in Scotland, and it was the days when tenants had to pay their rent.
Oh,
so we don't know if it's the quarter days are on the same dates as the fire festivals because one came before the other, or if the rent days just got put on the fire festivals because that was a really convenient way that no one could ever forget when they were. Either way, there's kind of that lining up with them. And that is why we see not only this idea that the fairies have this processional, this move from one home to another happening at Samhain, but that it's also the time they have to pay this tithe, this rent. Mm-hmm. So it's all kind of layered together. But yeah, there's a ton of folklore about that and beliefs about that. And of course, Samhain's also very strongly connected to witches. Interestingly, there's some overlap there as well. We see in Scotland stories about Nevin, who is the supernatural figure, probably originally a goddess, but sort of understood at later points as like a queen of the fairies and also a queen of the witches. And we have a reference to her in, I think it was Montgomery's Flighting, so 16th century, I think, where it talks about her on Samhain going out with her elves and her fairies and her witches in this procession. So sort of tying those two groups together, connecting them together, and this particular date. And
it's funny, I have heard Nick Nevin referred to as the witch mother or the mm-hmm. fairy queen. So, I mean, I've heard that many times over the years. So that to me is just fascinating that there's a tie-in between the two civilizations or two practices.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I keep picking on Scotland because we're discussing Tam Lin, but this mm-hmm. is elsewhere as well. But it's really fascinating the way that the two groups overlap. A lot of people, I assume not necessarily in this audience, but just in general, when they hear about witches and the witch trials, they always tend to think of the whole like demonic, sold your soul to the devil, demonic familiar kind of thing. But we actually find in at least a good percentage of the trial material is people who were connected to fairies, who had sworn allegiance to the queen of fairies, usually, who had a fairy familiar, who had been given knowledge of healing or, taught cunning craft through the fairies. So it's really interesting the way that all used to overlap and connect in a way that we don't tend to see it, at least very often today. We've kind of separated those two streams.
And interestingly, the Queen of Faerie shows up in accounts such as that, and then of course is very prominent in literature too. Mm-hmm. And sometimes is like an inspiring figure or an idealized figure, but she's the antagonist basically in this story. Is that a common role for the Queen of Faerie in folklore?
Not common, I would say. We tend to see her more either as a kind of neutral figure or as benevolent in a random sort of way. Mm-hmm. Like there's another ballad, the Ballad of Alison Gross, where a witch ends up turning this man into a worm. It's a long story that I won't get into, but turns him into a worm. And he's kind of cursed to just crawl around the base of this tree forever, which, to be fair, is an epically creative curse. But there's one particular, again, Halloween night, the Seelie Court, the good elves, for lack of a better translation, are passing by, and the fairy queen stops and lifts the curse and turns him back into a human. But there's no motivation for it. It's just something she decided to do because she felt like it. And that's sort of how she is in a lot of the material. Like, she can be very benevolent and helpful, but it's sort of unclear why she is sometimes and not other times, and why she does what she does. In Tam Lin, the reason she curses Janet is because Janet steals away one of her knights, whether or not he was going to, go to pay the tithe. In some versions of the ballad, as you may know, it's heavily implied the queen was actually in love with Tam Lin herself. Mm-hmm. And so she does not appreciate this upstart human girl showing up and messing that up. And there's a couple versions where it ends where the queen is basically, if she had known that Tam Lin and Janet had a thing, that she would have taken out his heart and replaced it with one of stone, or alternately taken out his eyes and replaced it with eyes from a tree, which are sort of like when you cut off a branch, you get that little weird stumpy looking thing. So basically implying she would have either made it so he could not see Janet to fall in love with her, or didn't have a heart so he couldn't fall in love with her, to prevent all of that from happening. So yeah, she has her reasons for not liking Janet at the end of the ballad.
And we're discussing the Queen of Faerie, but would you say this is a singular figure, or are we discussing, since we're discussing different sources, including Tam Lin? Yeah, do you prefer to consider them various queens, or how do you look at that?
So that gets a little tricky. In Irish folklore, it's definitely various queens. There are multiple named ones that we're aware of, and then there's a bunch that we don't know the names of anymore, but we kind of know by implication would have been there. In Scotland, it gets a little complicated because we have Nick Nevin, who is a named figure. She tends to be more strongly associated, particularly today, with the Unseelie court. So Seelie and Unseelie are Scots words, Scots being a language that is kind of a mashup of Norse and Gaelic and English. And Seelie means like blessed, fortunate, lucky, and Unseelie is the opposite of that. So the Seelie fairies, the Seelie court, are the ones that are the most likely to be helpful to humans, like the Seelie queen just stopping and unworming that guy. As opposed to the Unseelie, who are the ones that generally are malicious towards humans with no reason. They don't need a reason to be mad at you. They just are. So we have Nick Nevin, who's named, who's kind of associated with the Unseelie court. And then we have a lot of references to the Seelie queen, but we don't know what her name was, or if there would have been many of her, if she would have been a regional thing, kind of what was going on with that. We just don't have enough material to be sure. My personal opinion is it's probably multiple. It's probably the same as we have in Ireland, where different areas, different regions would have had their own version, and we've just lost a lot of that over time.
What elements of the story do you think could help us inform our practice?
Lots of it.
Yay.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of using Tam Lin and the other ballads to kind of help see different ways that we, particularly as witches, can interact with these beings, or look at like the proper way to do certain things, build connections, that sort of a thing. So when we look at Tam Lin, of course, we have the gold ring and the green mantle and the third thing, just to keep it cryptic. And we know from what the ballad is telling us that these would all be acceptable payments, acceptable tolls. If you're encountering these beings, and you kind of go prepared thinking, okay, I'm going to need to give them something. Because one thing with the good folk, which we find in Tam Lin and kind of everywhere else, is nothing is free. Everything has a cost. A lot of things in folklore with the good folk is about balance. And the idea that, if you're going to get something from them, you're going to give something to them. In the case of Tam Lin, the idea is you get permission to go through this area where this well is, but you have to give them something in order for that to happen. Even at the end, we see that when Janet rescues Tam Lin, she can't just pull him off his horse and that's the end of it. She has to go through this trial to prove herself, but also it is a way of kind of giving back to them, to showing that she deserves to get him, to win him. So you have that aspect of it. We see, of course, the idea that they're associated with particular places, even though they are, as you already mentioned, Aaron, they are transient. They can go from one place to another. They're not anchored in a specific location, but we can go to specific locations to connect to them. So if you are interested in that sort of a thing, and you know that there's a place that is known to be theirs, which usually is not subtle, like people know it, you can go there if you want that, with the understanding that you need to bring something to give to them. The idea that there is a connection that can happen. And this is something, like I said, I get into in the book I just finished, but talking about the relationships that people can have of a more intimate nature with the good folk. That is a thing. You see that in traditional witchcraft a lot with the idea of the fetch mate. I know Lee Morgan talks about that in some of his works. So that is certainly also something we can look at Tam Lin and get some ideas of how that can work. I don't know that we can rescue them and make them human in every case today, but we have that concept at least that's there that we can look at and kind of dig into. And there's a lot of other material that's in the ballad, which we haven't touched on just in this discussion, but things like how they appear, the way his horse appears, and it's very liminal in nature. It's got gold horseshoes in the front and silver in the back, which is kind of talking about the symbolism of being part of two worlds at the same time. Getting very metaphysical on you guys now. Sorry. The way that the fairy rate itself is described can tell us a lot about the good folk. Again, if you're interested in interacting with them or learning more about them, the way that they proceed, there's a certain order to it. It tells us a lot about the structure. There's a queen, there's knights, but there's also like squires and servants and maid servants and all kinds of things going on. He talks about how he's riding a white horse because that was a sign of rank, particularly important, which I realize in this context might not sound like that matters, but if you're in a visionary experience, if you're out in the woods and run into fairies, however it is you interact with them, guided meditation, dreams, and you see someone on a white horse, this tells you that that's significant, that someone riding a white horse in particular means that it's someone of rank or importance as opposed to, the others. So it's like a mini survival guide to interacting with fairies in the Ballad of Tam Lin. You just have to go through it and work through it all. Sorry, I know there's a lot.
No, that was perfect.
No,
in fact,
really good information.
There's some things that we hadn't drawn out of the story. Were there any specifically that you were hoping to discuss today that we haven't talked about more in depth?
I mean, we have covered a lot of ground, which is awesome. One thing which we didn't talk about, and this is something that shows up in one of the fragmented variants, is Tam Lin, when he's talking to Janet about, she asks him, were you ever actually human? Which you think she would have asked earlier, but she doesn't. So it comes up later when she's already pregnant, and he goes in this fragment, goes into this description of what it's like to be one of the good folk, which is making it clear that he actually is. He's not just a human in that world, but he talks about how changeable they are, that he can be very tiny or human sized, that they can kind of move through things and go where they will. And it's a lot of really good information kind of about when you deal with the good folk, that whatever you're seeing is just one option. They don't have like fixed permanent appearances and bodies and substance the way humans do. They're more fluid, which I guess also might be some queer coding going on. Take that however you want. But they're more fluid, and they can take different forms, and they can move in ways and are connected to nature in ways that humans just aren't. So that's also, I think, just really fascinating to consider, and important information. So if you're really interested in Tam Lin, I do strongly encourage people to read all of the variants. I know it's a little redundant because there's all of 11 of them, plus the little fragments, because each one of them, you'll learn something different. Each one of them is like a different piece of the same puzzle.
I think that's what intrigued me as I started reading the different versions and variants. That there was some of them had subtle differences, some of them had pretty significant differences.
Yes. Yeah, there's this is a slight tangent, but one of the main significant differences you'll find with the ballads is how consensual that third thing was. So in some of the versions, Janet is very clearly enthusiastically participating in what's happening. In others, though, it's pretty strongly implied that she was not. And that changes a lot of the tone of the story. So it's interesting to look at how those versions differ, why they are that way. And I do strongly encourage people, whether you're interested in getting, into a deep dive on Tam Lin or not, but just in general, try to find one version of it being performed and listen to it. Because it is a ballad. We read it because we have all these great versions that were written down, but it's meant to be performed and sung. And I found that hearing it that way is a whole different experience than sitting and reading it. And there's some good versions out there. Tricky Pixie has one, which I highly recommend. That's probably one of my favorites. And I believe Fairport Convention has one that you can find like on YouTube pretty easily.
I was going to ask, are these available on YouTube? Because everybody is so social media and connected technologically today.
Yeah, they are found on YouTube. And there's also a really, really good, it's a very modern variant. So it is heavily retold, we'll just say, but by Benjamin Zephaniah, who passed away recently. But it's a really good version. Very different kind of a story, but it's that same heart to it. And it will just also show you like how the variations can be, how different the spirits of them can be depending on who's performing them and what angle they're taking with it. But you definitely need to hear it sung at least once, I think.
I'm working on Jane Eyre, and I'm caught how the third story arc of Jane Eyre has some seeming influence from the tale of Tam Lin. There's some major differences, but even though she always introduces herself as Jane, Rochester insists on calling her Janet and keeps saying that her folk are the green coats, and but it turns out he's already married to a mad woman. And she, and as he's trying to cover up the secret, some days he's distant, some days he's close, some days he's, semi-violent. And then finally, the madwoman sets the manor on fire and he's blinded. And it's like, wow, there's a lot there. I have to think that while it's definitely not a retelling, I think Bronte was very familiar with this ballad.
Some of that spirit in it. No, that's very cool. And there have been novelizations done of the ballad. They all are interesting because you're taking a ballad and trying to turn it into a 300-page book. So a lot gets added in or changed. I do recommend, again, if it interests you, Kevin Manwaring has a book called The Knowing, and it's got a little bit of like Thomas the Rhymer going on. It's got some Tam Lin, and it's particularly looking at like what would have happened to Janet's descendants after she was cursed by the Queen of Fairies. Like what ripple effect does that have? Yeah, and the way he does it is really interesting, in my opinion, and pretty true to the folklore, which I always appreciate. So, if it interests people,
are there versions where the seduction of Thomas the Rhymer is sort of the first part of the story of Tom before he becomes Faerie?
Yep, there's a couple of the novel versions, I think, that blend the two. Which, I mean, you can see how that happens, because Thomas the Rhymer and then Tam Lin, who his name is Thomas, as we established, is just a short version of that. So not too far to kind of blend the two together. Little bit different, of course, because with Thomas the Rhymer, he was taken into Faerie by the queen for 7 years and then released. And then according to the folklore, not the ballad itself, but the later folklore, the queen later sent for him and he then returned to the world of Faerie. If queer retellings interest you, that's the second story that I did. And Thomas gets kidnapped by the Faerie king instead of the queen. So
I like that.
Yeah. Actually, I'm really proud of that one, because I made it a little more romantic than the first one.
Well, so that's the King
link.
of Elfland. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay.
Yep, the King of Elfland. And that's a queer retelling of Thomas the Rhymer. So, and then I have a third one, which I should remember the name of because I wrote it, but I don't at the moment. But it's the third one in the series, and it's the Alice Brand story retold. And in that case, the main character is trans. That
is great. Yeah, I'm good. I'm glad we got into those. I think that's our discussion then.
We covered a lot of ground.
Thank you so much. Is it traditional to actually, you were mentioning listening to these being performed. Is it traditional to sing these like as an offering to the fair folk? Like, were these ballads performed for them as well, or more for specifically human entertainment?
That's a good question. I suspect it was probably more for human entertainment, but because there's so much layered into it, I do think it would have worked as a teaching tale, a teaching song. And I do think that any of the good folk that happen to be around would find it pretty entertaining. So in a modern sense, like a modern witch, if you wanted to do this, to like sing it or perform it as an offering, I certainly think that would be appropriate.
We mentioned you are headlining Mystic South. Do you have any other events that you'd like to let people know about coming up this summer, this fall?
I am super busy this year because I have no sense of proportion. So I'm at the Morgan's Call retreat in June, which is in Connecticut. I'm at Mystic South in July. I will be at an online conference called Romancing the Gothic, which is an academic conference, but I highly recommend it to everyone because it was amazing last year. It was really a lot of fun, and the cost is very reasonable, and it's online. And the theme this year is devils and justified sinners. So I'm doing a presentation on the fairies and the tithe to hell and how they're connected in Scottish folklore to the devil, because he sometimes appears as the king of fairies in some of the stories, and sort of how those layers work together. And then in October, I'm probably going to be in Ireland for a sci-fi and fantasy convention called Octocon. So if you're in Dublin in October, look me up. And and then there's another online conference the end of October called Ancestral Pathways. And that one looks like it's going to have a lot of good stuff too. So
perfect.
Way too busy.
That is also exciting. Dave also will be at Mystic South. Is there any other things you want to let people know about?
You can find me on Facebook, The Weathered Wise Man, also on Instagram, weathered_wiseman_real. My book, Simple Magic of Wild Things, is out. But Mystic South is the next big venue. And I'm also putting together my Patreon, so be on the lookout for that. And also, Frater Aaron will be presenting at Mystic South. He didn't say
first
that.
Baby presentation. Yeah, I'll be presenting a paper on remnants of ecstatic practices in Grimm's fairy tales. So come to Mystic South and see all of us.
It's going to be a good time.
Yeah,
That is going to be a good time. I'm so excited to gather with you all. Well, thank you again for being here. Thank you for sharing the wealth of information. And until we meet again, may all your travels be filled with wonder.